Part 1. The Modern Paradox. Welcome, seekers of truth, to Realism Uncoded. Today, we embark on a journey into the heart of a paradox that quietly governs our world, a truth so uncomfortable, so counterintuitive, that most prefer to avert their gaze. Yet its understanding is paramount to truly comprehending the forces that shape our societies, our leaders, and indeed, our very lives. Look around you. We live in an era that champions empathy, collaboration, and compassion. Our public discourse is saturated with calls for kindness, for understanding, for a gentler approach to governance and human interaction. We celebrate leaders who embody these virtues, who speak of unity and shared humanity, and rightly so, for these are noble ideals, cornerstones of a civilized existence. But then, why does the world often feel so fractured? Why do we witness moments of decisive, even ruthless action from figures we once admired for their benevolence? Why do seemingly compassionate policies sometimes lead to unforeseen chaos, while seemingly harsh decisions, in retrospect, appear to have averted greater catastrophe? This is the paradox. We yearn for a world built on pure virtue, yet the reality we inhabit often demands something far more complex, something that whispers of a darker, more pragmatic necessity. Consider the leader who must make an impossible choice, to uphold a principle of absolute nonviolence, even if it means allowing a greater evil to flourish, or to employ a calculated, painful intervention that prevents widespread suffering, but at the cost of their own moral purity. Which path is truly virtuous? Which choice serves the greater good? Our modern sensibilities recoil from the latter, yet history is replete with instances where such a choice, however agonizing, proved to be the only bulwark against utter collapse. Think of the parent who must discipline a child, not out of anger, but out of a cold, hard understanding that unchecked indulgence will lead to ruin. The immediate act might seem harsh, even cruel to the child, yet it is born of a deeper love, a foresight into the potential for greater harm. Is this not a form of calculated cruelty, applied with a benevolent intent? Or consider the surgeon. Their act is one of profound healing, yet it involves the precise, deliberate infliction of pain, the cutting away of diseased tissue. To the uninitiated it might appear brutal, but we understand it as a necessary, life-saving measure. The pain is not the goal, it is the unavoidable means to a greater end: health, life, order. This is the uncomfortable truth we must confront, that sometimes, in the grand theater of human affairs, the path to order, to stability, to the prevention of widespread chaos, demands actions that, on the surface, appear to contradict our most cherished ideals of kindness and compassion. It suggests that there exists a hidden dimension to leadership, a brutal lesson that powerful figures throughout history have learned, often in secret, and applied with a chilling precision. We are taught to believe that good intentions always pave the way to good outcomes. But what if good intentions, untempered by a stark understanding of human nature and the realities of power, can inadvertently lead to disaster? What if the refusal to be cruel in a calculated moment, to inflict a precise and limited pain, can open the floodgates to an indiscriminate and far more devastating cruelty? This is not an endorsement of tyranny, nor a celebration of sadism. Far from it. This is an invitation to look beyond the surface, to question the simplistic narratives we are fed, and to understand the profound, often agonizing choices that leaders, and indeed all of us, face when confronted with the messy, unpredictable currents of human existence. There is a wisdom in this darkness, a profound insight into the mechanics of power and the preservation of order that has been whispered among the powerful for centuries, yet rarely articulated openly. Today, we will pull back the veil. We will explore the philosophy that dares to articulate this uncomfortable truth, a philosophy that has been reviled and misunderstood, yet continues to exert an undeniable influence on the world stage. Prepare to challenge your assumptions, to confront a reality that is both unsettling and undeniably potent. For in understanding this brutal lesson, you will gain a new lens through which to view the world, a profound awareness that empowers you to discern the true nature of power, and perhaps to reclaim your own. Part 2. The Unseen Problem. Digging Deeper. The paradox we introduced is not merely an academic curiosity, it is a pervasive, unseen problem that subtly yet profoundly shapes our daily lives. It is the quiet hum of inefficiency, the sudden eruption of disorder, the slow erosion of trust that occurs when the fundamental, often harsh, realities of human nature are ignored in the pursuit of an idealized, yet ultimately unsustainable, vision of society. Let us delve deeper into how this unseen problem manifests. Consider the realm of public policy. We often see well-intentioned initiatives designed to foster equality, promote welfare, or encourage certain behaviors. These policies are crafted with the purest of motives, aiming to uplift, to support, to create a more harmonious society. Yet time and again, we witness their unintended consequences. A policy designed to help the vulnerable might inadvertently create dependency. A measure intended to foster fairness might inadvertently stifle innovation or reward indolence. Why does this happen? Because the architects of these policies, in their noble pursuit of an ideal, often fail to account for the darker, more self-interested, or simply more chaotic aspects of human behavior. They assume a level of altruism, rationality, or compliance that simply does not exist universally. When the cruel reality of human imperfection is not factored in, when the potential for exploitation or resistance is overlooked, the system becomes vulnerable. It becomes a house built on sand, susceptible to the slightest tremor of human vice or folly. Think of a community that prides itself on its absolute tolerance and open-mindedness, refusing to set firm boundaries or enforce strict rules, fearing that any form of restriction would be cruel or oppressive. Initially, this might foster a sense of freedom, but without a clear framework, without the occasional calculated imposition of limits, chaos can slowly creep in. Petty disputes escalate, norms erode, and eventually, the very freedom they sought to protect is undermined by the absence of order. The refusal to apply a small, calculated cruelty, the enforcement of a rule, the imposition of a consequence, leads to a far greater indiscriminate cruelty of disorder and insecurity. In the corporate world, we see this play out in organizations that prioritize niceness above all else. Performance issues are ignored to avoid uncomfortable conversations. Underperformers are retained to prevent hurt feelings. Decisions are delayed to achieve universal consensus, even when swift action is needed. The result? A slow, agonizing decline. The cruelty of a direct, honest performance review, or the decisive, unpopular decision to restructure, is avoided. But the consequence is the cruelty of job losses for many, the collapse of the company, and the erosion of livelihoods. The small, calculated pain that could have saved the whole is sidestepped, leading to a much larger, more widespread suffering. Even in our personal lives, this unseen problem lurks. We might avoid setting firm boundaries with friends or family members, fearing we might appear mean or uncaring. We might shy away from delivering difficult truths, preferring to maintain a superficial harmony. But this avoidance, this refusal to inflict a necessary, calculated discomfort, often leads to resentment, exploitation, and ultimately, the breakdown of relationships. The cruelty of a direct confrontation, delivered with clarity and purpose, can prevent the far greater cruelty of a relationship poisoned by unspoken grievances and festering resentments. The problem is that we have been conditioned to view cruelty as inherently evil, as always synonymous with malice or sadism. We fail to distinguish between indiscriminate, malicious cruelty and a calculated, precise application of force or discomfort for a greater, benevolent purpose. This intellectual blind spot leaves us vulnerable. It leaves us unprepared for the realities of leadership, governance, and even personal responsibility. When leaders, whether in government, business, or community, are unwilling or unable to make tough decisions that might be perceived as harsh, they often inadvertently create a vacuum that is filled by genuine chaos, by true injustice, by the unbridled self-interest of others. The refusal to be cruel in a limited, strategic sense can lead to a situation where the truly cruel and unscrupulous thrive, because there are no boundaries, no consequences, no deterrents. This is the unseen problem, our collective aversion to the pragmatic, sometimes uncomfortable realities of maintaining order and preventing chaos. We want the garden to flourish, but we are unwilling to prune the diseased branches, to pull the invasive weeds, or to build the fence that keeps out destructive forces. We desire peace, but we are hesitant to acknowledge that peace often requires the capacity and sometimes the willingness to wage a limited, precise war against disorder. This problem is not abstract. It is the reason why some societies falter, why some organizations collapse, and why some individuals find themselves perpetually adrift. It is the consequence of ignoring a fundamental truth about human nature and the dynamics of power. But what is this truth, and who dared to articulate it with such chilling clarity? It is time to turn to the philosopher who, more than any other, laid bare this brutal lesson. Part 3. The Philosopher's Revelation, the Dark Truth. In the tumultuous crucible of Renaissance Florence, a man named Niccolò Machiavelli observed the ebb and flow of power, the rise and fall of states, and the unchanging, often brutal nature of humanity. From his observations, he distilled a philosophy so stark, so unvarnished, that it has been both reviled and secretly revered for centuries. His revelation, particularly articulated in The Prince, is this: a leader, to maintain order and prevent greater chaos, must learn to be cruel. But let us be precise. Machiavelli was not advocating for wanton sadism or arbitrary tyranny. He was not suggesting that a leader should revel in the suffering of their subjects. On the contrary, Machiavelli was a pragmatist, deeply concerned with the stability and prosperity of the state. His cruelty is a calculated surgical instrument, employed not for its own sake, but as a necessary means to a higher end: the preservation of the body politic, the prevention of widespread anarchy, and ultimately, the security and well-being of the populace. Machiavelli understood that human beings are by nature fickle, ungrateful, dissimulators, fearful of danger, and greedy for gain. He saw that love, while desirable, is a bond easily broken when self-interest intervenes. Fear, however, is a bond that rarely fails, because it is sustained by a dread of punishment that never abandons men. Therefore, he argued, it is far safer for a prince to be feared than loved, if he cannot be both. This is the core of his brutal lesson. A leader must be willing to inflict pain, to make examples, to be decisive and unyielding when the situation demands it, not out of malice, but out of a cold, rational assessment of what is required to maintain control. He famously stated that a prince should desire to be held merciful, but should take care not to misuse that mercy. He gave the example of Cesare Borgia, who, upon conquering Romagna, sent his cruel minister, Ramiro de Orco, to restore order. Orco did so with extreme severity, bringing peace but also hatred upon himself. Borgia then had Orco publicly executed, satisfying the people and demonstrating that any cruelty was Orco's doing, while the order was Borgia's. This was a calculated act of cruelty, the execution of one man, that served to prevent the greater cruelty of continued anarchy and rebellion. Machiavelli's point is that a leader who is too merciful, too unwilling to use force, too afraid to be seen as harsh, will inevitably lose control. Their leniency will be perceived as weakness, inviting challenges, fostering disorder, and ultimately leading to a state of affairs far more cruel and destructive than any calculated act of severity. The cruelty of a few, precisely applied, prevents the cruelty of the many, indiscriminately unleashed. Consider the problem we discussed in Part 2, the well-intentioned policies that fail, the communities that descend into chaos, the organizations that collapse due to a refusal to make tough decisions. Machiavelli's philosophy provides the chilling aha moment. These failures often stem from a fundamental misunderstanding or a deliberate avoidance of this brutal truth. A leader who refuses to punish corruption decisively, fearing public backlash, will find corruption festering and spreading, ultimately undermining the entire system. The cruelty of a swift, public punishment for a few prevents the cruelty of systemic rot that harms everyone. A leader who hesitates to deploy force against a nascent rebellion, hoping for a peaceful resolution, might find that hesitation allows the rebellion to grow into a full-blown civil war, leading to far greater bloodshed and suffering. The cruelty of a preemptive, decisive strike prevents the cruelty of prolonged, widespread conflict. This is not about being cruel for the sake of it, but about understanding that the absence of calculated severity can be a far greater cruelty. It is about the leader's responsibility to the state, to the collective, which sometimes transcends individual moral comfort. Machiavelli's leader is a physician of the state, willing to use the scalpel to excise the cancer, even if the procedure is painful, to save the patient. This dark truth is unsettling because it forces us to confront the uncomfortable reality that the world is not always governed by pure ideals. It suggests that effective leadership often requires a pragmatic understanding of human nature's darker impulses and the willingness to counteract them with decisive, sometimes harsh measures. It is a lesson that powerful figures, from ancient emperors to modern heads of state, have learned and applied, often in the shadows, to maintain their grip on power and, in many cases, to preserve the very fabric of their societies. Machiavelli simply dared to write it down. Part 4. The Consequences, the Price of Ignorance. To ignore Machiavelli's brutal lesson, to cling solely to an idealized vision of leadership devoid of calculated severity, is to pay a steep price. This ignorance is not benign. It is a corrosive force that undermines stability, invites chaos, and ultimately leads to a far greater, more indiscriminate suffering for society and the individual. Consider the historical examples. Empires and states that became too soft, too unwilling to enforce their laws, too hesitant to punish dissent or corruption, invariably crumbled from within or were conquered from without. The Roman Empire, in its later stages, faced internal strife and external threats. Its inability to decisively quell internal rebellions and its increasing reliance on appeasement rather than firm governance contributed to its eventual decline. The cruelty of a strong, centralized authority, capable of swift and decisive action, was replaced by a fragmented, indecisive leadership, leading to the far greater cruelty of widespread instability, economic collapse, and barbarian invasions. Look at the French Revolution. The initial ideals of liberty, equality, and fraternity were noble. However, the inability of the revolutionary government to establish firm, consistent authority, coupled with its reluctance to employ calculated force against internal and external threats, led to the Reign of Terror. This period of indiscriminate violence, far from being a calculated cruelty, was a chaotic, uncontrolled explosion of fear and paranoia. Had a more Machiavellian leader been in place, one willing to apply precise, limited severity to consolidate power and suppress genuine threats early on, the widespread, arbitrary executions and the subsequent decades of instability might have been averted. The refusal to be cruel in a calculated manner led to a truly cruel and indiscriminate bloodbath. In contemporary society, we see the price of this ignorance in the rise of lawlessness in certain urban areas. When authorities are perceived as unwilling or unable to enforce laws, when consequences for criminal behavior are minimal or non-existent, a vacuum is created. This vacuum is quickly filled by those who operate outside the bounds of civility. The cruelty of strict law enforcement, of swift justice, is avoided. But the consequence is the cruelty of increased crime rates, fear, economic decline, and a diminished quality of life for law-abiding citizens. The refusal to inflict a limited, calculated pain on offenders leads to a pervasive, indiscriminate pain for the entire community. On an individual level, the price of ignoring this truth is equally high. We often encounter individuals who are perpetually taken advantage of, who struggle to assert their boundaries, or who find themselves in chaotic relationships. These individuals, often driven by a desire to be nice or to avoid conflict at all costs, refuse to employ a calculated cruelty. The firm no, the decisive boundary, the willingness to walk away from a toxic situation. Their avoidance of this small, necessary discomfort leads to the far greater cruelty of their own exploitation, emotional exhaustion, and a life lived without genuine respect or agency. The price of ignorance is the erosion of order. It is the slow creep of anarchy, not necessarily in the form of violent revolution, but in the subtle breakdown of norms, the weakening of institutions, and the diminishing of collective security. When leaders are paralyzed by the fear of being perceived as cruel, they become ineffective. They lose the capacity to protect their people from internal and external threats. They become spectators to the very chaos they were meant to prevent. This is why Machiavelli's lesson, though brutal, is so vital. It is a warning against naive idealism, against the dangerous assumption that good intentions alone are sufficient to navigate the complexities of power and human nature. It forces us to acknowledge that sometimes the most compassionate act for the collective is one that appears on the surface to be harsh. The failure to understand this distinction, the refusal to wield the scalpel when necessary, condemns us to a world where the disease of disorder is allowed to spread unchecked, inflicting a far more profound and widespread suffering. The price of ignorance is not merely inconvenience. It is the very stability and security of our existence. Part 5. The Path Forward. Reclaiming Your Power. We have journeyed through the uncomfortable truths of Machiavelli's philosophy, confronting the paradox of calculated cruelty and the steep price of ignoring it. Now we arrive at the most crucial part of our exploration, the path forward. For understanding this brutal lesson is not about embracing cynicism or advocating for tyranny. It is about reclaiming your power through awareness. The power you gain is not the power to inflict pain, but the power of discernment. It is the ability to see beyond the superficial narratives, to understand the true mechanics of power, and to recognize when a seemingly harsh action is, in fact, a necessary measure to prevent greater harm. This awareness empowers you to be a more astute observer of the world, a more effective participant in society, and a more resilient individual in your own life. How does this translate into actionable insights? First, cultivate a nuanced understanding of leadership. When you observe leaders making difficult, unpopular decisions that appear cruel or uncompromising, pause before judgment. Ask yourself, is this an act of arbitrary malice? Or is it a calculated measure designed to prevent a larger, more devastating chaos? Is this leader willing to bear the burden of being feared if it means securing the stability that benefits all? This perspective allows you to evaluate leadership not just by their stated intentions, but by their actual outcomes and the underlying strategic necessity of their actions. Second, apply this discernment to your own life. Where are you being too nice to your own detriment? Where are you avoiding necessary uncomfortable conversations or decisions out of a fear of being perceived as mean or harsh? Perhaps it's setting firm boundaries with a demanding friend, or having a difficult conversation with a family member about their behavior, or making a tough career decision that might disappoint some. These are your moments to apply a calculated cruelty, a precise, limited discomfort to prevent a greater, more pervasive suffering in your own life. This is not about being unkind, but about being strategically firm for your own well-being and the health of your relationships. Third, recognize the difference between true malice and pragmatic necessity. The world is full of genuine cruelty, born of hatred, greed, or sadism. Machiavelli's lesson is not a justification for this. Instead, it provides a framework for understanding those rare, agonizing moments when a leader must choose the lesser of two evils, when the path to order demands a temporary, precise application of force or severity. This distinction is vital. It prevents you from being manipulated by simplistic narratives and allows you to identify true threats to order, whether they come from overt chaos or from the well-intentioned but ultimately destabilizing refusal to act decisively. This philosophy empowers you to be less naive, more resilient, and more effective in a complex world. It teaches you that true compassion for the collective sometimes requires a willingness to make choices that are individually uncomfortable. It is the wisdom of the gardener who prunes a healthy branch to ensure the tree's overall vitality, or the surgeon who cuts to save a life. The act itself may seem harsh, but the intent is preservation. The outcome is health. The goal is not to become Machiavellian in the pejorative sense, a ruthless, amoral manipulator. The goal is to become Machiavellian in the analytical sense, someone who understands the profound, often hidden forces that govern power and order. It is about seeing the world as it is, not merely as we wish it to be. So, as you step back into the world, carry this new lens with you. Observe the leaders, the institutions, and even your own interactions. Ask yourself, what is the true cost of unchecked idealism? What is the hidden necessity behind seemingly harsh decisions? For in understanding why a leader must sometimes learn to be cruel, you gain not a license for brutality, but a profound, empowering insight into the delicate, often agonizing balance required to maintain order and prevent the far greater, indiscriminate chaos that truly threatens us all. The truth, however dark, is always a path to greater power.